Why are there laws of logic? Why are there laws of mathematics?
They're a product of consciousness. And laws of mathematics are not a thing in themselves, but rather a way to explain the universe. So the laws of mathematics would not exist without human beings, so they are subjective. But the things that they describe would.
Oh, no, hold on.
So when you talk about logic, when you talk about reason, these things aren't ends, they're means. They're means to understanding certain things. So we use reason to understand that the Earth goes around the sun. We use the laws of maths to understand how that happened. You and I agree that, for instance, I assume that we would agree that human flourishing is a good thing.
Oh, sure.
But you would say that that's because you have that in you because of God. I say that I have that in me because of evolution.
It's not just because it's in me, but because there's an objective standard of goodness outside of ourselves.
Absolutely
and
fine.
so when you say that we can agree that we want to have a better society, as Justin pointed out earlier, you're implying a best. Because in order to say something's better or worse, you have to imply a best. Well, what is that best? What is the ontological grounding of that best?
Not necessarily. You don't have to have. This reminds me of one of Thomas Aquinas' famous 5 ways, the degrees of perfection. There doesn't need to be an absolute perfection to have an idea of something which is more perfect than something else. And to your reference of C.S. Lewis,
I think there would have to be a standard of perfection, or a standard that you're aiming for, to say you're getting closer to that standard or further away, better or worse.
It's like your reference to C.S. Lewis. You can't know a crooked line without having some idea of straight. I don't think that's true. For instance, think of it this way.
Why is it not true?
It's not a case, if you're talking about good and evil, you don't need evil to know good. If you think about, say you have a flat plane.
You're absolutely right about that.
Think about you have a flat plane.
You don't need evil to know good, I agree with you. So you need good to know evil, though.
I don't think so either.
Evil does exist, as much as that may be a problem for why a loving God would allow evil. Nonetheless, it's a signpost that something beyond the material world has to exist to allow this realm of good and evil to exist. In fact,
I think Alex recognizes that signpost, because on his website he rails, I think rightfully, against some of the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, where he talks about how priests have sexually abused children, and obviously that's a great wrong. But my question is, Alex, if you really think that is a great wrong, why would you deny objective morality? I mean, is that really wrong, or is it just a matter of personal opinion?
Well, I think that we agree in one sense that evil doesn't necessarily disprove God. I'm with you on that. What I would say is to answer your question, objectively, no. It is a subjective thing. Morality, to me, is entirely subjective.
Why do you say that?
Well, because, firstly, a thing to note is that objective morality... Well, let's talk about what objective actually means, I suppose. Objectivity, to me, if you want my definition, would be to say that it is true regardless of human intervention, regardless of human consciousness. For instance, the Earth orbits the Sun. That would be true if all humans disappeared.
Right. Every
single one of them. It would still be an objective fact. But to say that murder is wrong, if every human disappeared, that couldn't still be wrong, surely. That would be a nonsense concept without some kind of human psychology. The only way that you could argue that perhaps it would still be wrong is if there was some kind of transcendent being. But then you need to have that being in order to prove the existence of the objective morality that you're then using to prove the God. So
but what we're doing is we're reasoning from effect to cause, that we have this effect known as this moral law that is pressing on us. And as you admitted in the video, and look, videos, 2-minute videos, 10-minute videos, you can't expound on all the nuances. So if this is wrong, correct me. But you seem to say that we, in fact, I think you quoted, the quote was, let me just quote you accurately on this, because in the video you said this. You said moral truths are so deeply ingrained in us that they feel like they are objective.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so... my question is, why would you doubt they're objective if they're so deeply ingrained in us?
Well, because this is where I think Sam Harris is right, in the sense that if you have certain assumptions, so let's say that we could assume that human well-being was a good thing. We'll discuss why shortly, but let's say we assume that. We could then say that it is objectively true that we should act in certain ways, for instance, trying not to murder people. And that would then become an objective morality. Right. So because evolution has instilled within us, through genetics, a drive to stay alive, then we can derive objective moral truths about how we should act in order that complies with this inner nature, which I think has come about through evolution. So even if you don't subscribe to the idea that certain moral actions, such as not killing or not stealing, have come about through evolution, the instinctual nature within us to stay alive causes us to think of those as objective truths. But it's a technicality. So for all intents and purposes, you could say they're objective truths. If you grab 100 people off the street and ask them, is rape wrong? 100 of them will say yes. But that doesn't mean it's objective. I mean, for instance, I put it to you, would you say that chocolate is tasty?
Yeah, I would, but that's a subjective.
Right, sure.
Some people may not like chocolate.
It's subjective.
Yeah.
That's
a flavor.
So tar can be just as tasty as chocolate. But that's no problem, right? That's no problem whatsoever. So when you say something along the lines of, so morality is subjective. So what Hitler did being wrong was just an opinion. Well, yes, but in the same sense that chocolate tasting as good as tar is an opinion.
See, I think when
it doesn't make a difference.
Alex is right to say morality can be subjective and still meaningful. We don't need a God to recognize that rape, murder, or child abuse are wrong, because we understand harm, suffering, and empathy directly as human beings. That's not a weakness in morality. It's how moral reasoning actually works. Research in evolutionary psychology shows that our sense of right and wrong developed to help humans cooperate and survive. Empathy, fairness, and reciprocity are traits seen not just in humans but in primates, elephants, even rats. These aren't divine instructions. They're natural, social instincts shaped over millions of years. Moral philosopher Philippa Foot showed that moral claims are grounded in human needs and natural facts, not commands from above. When we say something is wrong, we're pointing to real-world harm, not breaking a supernatural rule. Frank's claim that moral disagreement means morality must be objective misunderstands how moral systems develop. Disagreement doesn't mean there's no truth. It means we're still working to understand it, like any area of knowledge. Let's hear Frank Turek's response.
Well, no, I think it does, because it's much more obvious that, say, sexually abusing children is wrong than atheism's true.
Right.
So why would you say that atheism is true in order to avoid the obvious conclusion that sexually abusing children is wrong? You already know sexually abusing children is wrong. Now, if you want to use an evolutionary argument, the problem is that undercuts everything you think. Because if everything we think is the product of evolution, the product of the laws of physics or biology, or whatever it is, then why should we believe anything we think? Forget about morality for a second. Why should we even believe that atheism is true or that Christianity is true? If we're completely... I'm sorry, I'm suffering from jet lag here. If our thoughts are the result of some random evolutionary process, why should we believe anything we think is true?
Well, the first thing is that evolution isn't a random process. But that aside, it's
let me put it this way: it's either directed by an outside intelligence or it's not.
Sure, okay, I'll give
If
you
it's not directed by an outside intelligence, then it's random.
Yes,
So if it's directed by intelligence, then perhaps God exists. If it's not directed by intelligence, why should we believe anything we think?
It's this idea, it's almost sort of existential. You know, why should we believe anything if there's no guidance? To me, it's like asking the question, like you said earlier, about, you know, how do we know that we even exist, or that the universe wasn't created last Thursday? For me, it's somewhat based on consensus. It doesn't prove it's true, but reason is one of those things that we need to assume in order to get anywhere. In the same sense, we need to assume that we exist in order to have a philosophical discussion.
No, that's a very wise point. I agree with you. The question is, how do we explain reason on a naturalistic worldview?
Well, reason and consciousness can be explained as coming about through evolution. The way in which we sense the world.
But let's stop there for just a second, though, Alex. If that's the case, why should we trust it?
Oh, well, we don't necessarily have to. Again, it's a subjective thing. But every single person...
But that would mean reason's subjective.
Yes, well, it is.
Well, if reason is subjective, then...
If reason's not subjective, then how do you and I come to different conclusions, both using reason?
Because we have free will. if reason's subjective, we couldn't even communicate. If there weren't these objective, unchanging laws of logic.
Well, yes, there are objective rules and tenets of reason, but reason itself is subjective in the same way that morality, you can say, under certain assumptions, there are objective truths about morality. If you have a certain assumption about reason, then yes, there are objective tenets.
Well, that's what I mean. These immaterial laws of logic that aren't made of molecules, how do we explain those on a naturalistic worldview?
How do you mean? How do we explain?
Why are there laws of logic? Why are there laws of mathematics?
They're a product of consciousness. And laws of mathematics are not a thing in themselves, but rather a way to explain the universe. So the laws of mathematics would not exist without human beings, so they are subjective. But the things that they describe would.
Oh, no, hold on.
So when you talk about logic, when you talk about reason, these things aren't ends, they're means. They're means to understanding certain things. So we use reason to understand that the Earth goes around the sun.
Frank tries to argue that if our minds are the product of evolution, then we can't trust reason or moral beliefs. But this misunderstands how evolution works. Natural selection favors organisms that accurately perceive and respond to their environment, because those that don't, die. The fact that we can land spacecraft on other planets, predict disease patterns, and build the internet is strong evidence that our evolved brains are reliably processing information. Reason isn't some magical gift that requires a divine source. It's a tool, a cognitive strategy that evolved because it helped our species survive. Neuroscience confirms this. Our brains are built to detect patterns, solve problems, and simulate future outcomes. These abilities enhanced our fitness in the ancestral environment. As for logic and math, those aren't floating laws that exist outside time and space. They're descriptive systems we created to understand consistent patterns in nature. The Pythagorean theorem works not because it was written in the sky by a god, but because we observed relationships in geometry that are always true under certain conditions. Alex is right to say that these tools, reason, logic, math, are means, not ends. They help us model reality. We assume their usefulness because they work. No faith in the supernatural is required.
I like what Louise Antony said in her debate with William Lane Craig. Louise Antony is an atheist, but she admitted something about morality and atheism that I think is very insightful. Here's what she said. This is her quote. She said, "Any argument for moral skepticism will be based upon premises which are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values themselves." In other words, here she is as an atheist saying, I have this sense of moral obligation that is so strong that any argument you give me for atheism or moral subjectivism will be based on the weaker premises than just the sense that I have that objective moral values and obligations exist. So that was my question originally to you, Alex, is why would you deny the strongest belief that you have intuitively and adopt a weaker belief in atheism or agnosticism?
Well, I don't deny it, because I don't deny, like I say, as long as I do have certain assumptions, and I admit that there are assumptions, I can say that I have an objective sense that these things are wrong on the assumption that I'm aiming for human prosperity.
Right, but you already pointed out that Sam Harris is begging the question on that. That is his human flourishing. And that's a conflation of epistemology and ontology. And as you pointed out, rightfully so, and 18 years old, he's already figured this out, which I didn't know this is 18, that Sam Harris is confusing epistemology and ontology. He's assuming what he's trying to prove.
But the problem with Sam Harris's argument is he's going in there trying to show that certain things are right or wrong based on science. What I'm trying to do is say why people experience things as right or wrong based on science, which can be done. So I can say the reason that I feel that this is right and wrong is because of this. What I can't say is that this is right or wrong because of this.
I mean, does this mean, is it a problem for you then, telling people what they ought to do? Because there's a sense in which, you know, if you see a society being racist or treating women unequally or whatever it might be.
Or Catholic priests abusing children like you do on your website, you say that's wrong?
For me, the problem has always been, for the atheist who denies objective morality, is what right do you have to tell someone else? Because they're just acting according to their subjective preferences.
Well, the subjective preferences, I find, in these cases, we often agree. So, for instance, if I meet a member of the Ku Klux Klan, we can find common ground in the sense that I might say, okay, so why is this wrong? Why is that wrong? Why? Until we get to the final point and they say, well, I think that it's because my worldview is better for humanity. And I say, well, hang on, so do I. I think my worldview is better for humanity. So let's go on the assumption that what we want is to get what's best for humanity. And here's how I think my worldview leads to that. So even people...
but if they say, but I don't believe black people are human... What do you say to that?
Well, that's the thing. Then the discussion doesn't then the discussion becomes trying to prove how they are.
Right.
You sort of remove the need for a basis once you find out what the basis of their beliefs are. Once you find that common ground. For instance, me and you agree. You and I agree that, for instance, I assume that we would agree that human flourishing is a good thing.
Oh, sure.
But you would say that that's because you have that in you because of God. I say that I have that in me because of evolution.
It's not just because it's in me, but because there's an objective standard of goodness outside of ourselves.
Absolutely
and
fine.
so when you say that we can agree that we want to have a better society, as Justin pointed out earlier, you're implying a best. Because in order to say something's better or worse, you have to imply a best. Well, what is that best? What is the ontological grounding of that best?
Not necessarily. You don't have to have... This reminds me of one of Thomas Aquinas' famous 5 ways, the degrees of perfection. There doesn't need to be an absolute perfection to have an idea of something which is more perfect than something else. And to your reference of C.S. Lewis...
I think there would have to be a standard of perfection, or a standard that you're aiming for, to say you're getting closer to that standard or further away, better or worse.
It's like your reference to C.S. Lewis. You can't know a crooked line without having some idea of straight. I don't think that's true. For instance, think of it this way.
Why is it not true?
It's not a case, if you're talking about good and evil, you don't need evil to know good. If you think about, say you have a flat plane.
You're absolutely right about that.
Think about you have a flat plane.
You don't need evil to know good, I agree with you.
So,
you need good to know evil, though.
I don't think so either. If you have a flat plane, you can see like a hill, like an indentation on that flat plane. Now, the rest of that plane is not a valley. You don't need the valley to understand the hill. You just need the hill in comparison to what is neutral. So you can have evil compared to what is neutral. You can have good compared to what is neutral. You don't need the two extremes.
What would be your definition of evil?
My definition of evil? Well, that's a very broad thing. But if you're asking me, again, subjectively, anything I would say that unwarrantedly elicits human suffering or animal suffering to an extent.
Okay,
as well.
so that would imply that it's the opposite of human flourishing. So it's very difficult to define evil without reference to good.
Not necessarily. It's not. It may be the opposite of human flourishing, but it's also just the absence of no suffering. Not necessarily good, but no evil. In the same sense, this is what frustrates me about atheists a lot, is they'll do the same thing but the opposite. They'll look at God and they'll think of the evil. They'll listen to Hitchens talk about some celestial North Korea and they'll recoil at that and they'll say, that's a horrible thing. I can't imagine that reality. But I'm sorry, just because you don't like a reality doesn't make it not real. And so if there are no objective morals, then unfortunately what Joseph Stalin did in the USSR was not objectively wrong. But that's not a shocking thing to say if we're under the assumption that nothing is objectively wrong.
Do you understand then why for many people the moral argument is so powerful?
Absolutely.
Because they cannot get themselves to a point of view where those kinds of acts are only really about people's preferences.
But I don't think that's what Frank is necessarily doing, because I think you're right that a lot of people do just recoil in horror at the idea of there being no objective standard, but I don't think that's what you're doing. I'd say that you're being cleverer than that. You're understanding that, yes, this is a bad idea, but more than that, you're saying that there's some way to prove that there is an objective reality, not just because you don't like...
Yeah, I want to get beyond that, or maybe I should say underneath that, going back to Justin's point, and it's this. If you said this is all the result of evolution, you have to get outside the evolutionary process to believe that thought is true. Because if that thought is a result of the evolutionary process as well, why believe it?
Frank appeals to emotion when he says that without objective morality, we can't call things like Stalin's atrocities truly wrong. But this only proves that people feel moral convictions deeply. It doesn't prove they're grounded in something supernatural. Alex is right to point out that we can talk about better and worse actions based on their consequences, specifically how they affect well-being and reduce suffering. That's not arbitrary. It's measurable. If a society promotes human flourishing, reduces cruelty, and improves life for the most people, that's a clear moral improvement, even without invoking a divine standard. Philosophers like Derek Parfit and Peter Singer have shown that you don't need a god to get to universal ethics. You just need reason, empathy, and a commitment to consistency. Most people already agree on basic moral values because we're wired for empathy and shaped by social norms. And when we disagree, we use reason and evidence to argue for better outcomes, not scripture. Christianity doesn't own morality. In fact, some of the Bible's moral teachings, like support for slavery, genocide, and patriarchy, are now considered deeply wrong because our understanding of morality has evolved. So Alex is right. Morality is not about divine rules. It's about how we treat each other in the real world. What do you think makes a society truly moral? Dogma or compassion?
I mean, you wrote a book called How Jesus Became God. And of course, one of the key claims of the Gospels is Jesus claiming divinity, claiming to be God, and that takes different manifestations in different Gospels. But what's your view? Is your view that anything that looks like Jesus claiming some kind of divine status is more likely an amendment of the Jesus story than an original part?
So I wouldn't put it quite that simply. I mean, there are people today who claim to be God, and so I don't say they didn't say that because somebody wouldn't say that. People do say that, and so the issue is always how do you know what Jesus said? When it comes to the New Testament Gospels, we of course have the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as I was saying earlier, it looks like Matthew and Luke have both used Mark. Mark is probably our earliest account. Matthew and Luke are later. Matthew and Luke appear to have used some other source that we don't have anymore for a number of their sayings of Jesus. And scholars have called the source Q, and it doesn't matter to my argument whether you think Q existed or not. But Luke does say he had earlier sources, so it's not implausible that he had a source that had some of Jesus' sayings. And so what scholars do when trying to figure out what Jesus really said, once they acknowledge that maybe he didn't say everything, because we know Jesus didn't say everything that's attributed to him in the early church, because we have other Gospels that everybody agrees Jesus didn't say these things. Okay. So somebody's making up stories, and the question is, and people are changing stories, and so we have absolute evidence that there's no question about it. So the question is whether that happens in the four Gospels or not, or whether somehow they were protected from ever recording anything that Jesus actually didn't ever say. Were they protected from that? And what is striking to most scholars is that when you lay out the sources chronologically, over time, Jesus starts changing the sorts of things that he says.
A lot of people assume Jesus always claimed to be God, but Bart Ehrman is showing us why that's not so simple. He explains that our earliest gospel, Mark, doesn't present Jesus as clearly divine the way John does, which came much later. Over time, the way Jesus talks in the Gospels shifts. In earlier accounts, Jesus is more like a prophet or a teacher. But in later ones, he starts saying things that sound more divine. That's important, because it shows how stories about Jesus evolved. Scholars agree that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus died, by people who weren't eyewitnesses. They also had different sources. Some we don't even have anymore. And it's a fact that people in the early church were adding, changing, or even making up stories. We see that in other Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. So if the stories changed over time, how can we be sure Jesus actually said he was God? That's the real question. Let's hear more from Bart to see how this all unfolded. He's about to share specific examples.
And so, for example, in Mark and in Q, which would be the sayings in Matthew and Luke not found in Mark, those would probably be our earliest sources. Jesus principally talks about the kingdom of God that's coming. There's a kingdom of God that's coming. You need to repent and prepare for it, because if you don't, you're going to be destroyed. If you are on the side of God, you'll enter into this kingdom and there'll be a glorious existence. And so Jesus is preaching about the coming kingdom of God in Mark and Q. When you get to the Gospel of John, Jesus no longer preaches about the kingdom of God. He doesn't tell people to repent in preparation for the coming of the kingdom of God. He doesn't say that you'll be destroyed when the kingdom of God comes. The way he talks is different now. And rather than talking principally about God and the coming kingdom, he talks about himself, who he is. And so you get some of the most famous sayings of Jesus. Especially
I am the way, the truth, and the life.
The way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life.
The Good Shepherd.
Before Abraham was, I am. I and the Father are one. You get all of these claims, many of which have a component of divine identity connected with him. He's claiming to be a divine being. That's crystal clear in the narrative of John, because whenever Jesus will say, I and the Father are one, and the Jews will pick up stones to stone him to death for committing blasphemy. You don't have those stories in the earliest Gospels. And it's striking, and you have to explain, if Jesus did go around calling himself a divine being, if that really happened, as John says. John says it happened. And it's the major teaching of Jesus in John. If that's what happened, why isn't it in Mark or Q? Is it that they didn't think it was important to report that part of Jesus' teachings? Or a more plausible explanation for most people, for most critical scholars, a more plausible explanation is that over time, the Christians' understanding of Jesus changed, and they started seeing him as less of just a human Messiah and more as some kind of divine being over time. And as they saw him that way, they recorded his words in those ways. And so the later sayings of John are later representations of what later Christians said about Jesus, rather than what the earliest Christians. And if you think the earliest Christians thought this about Jesus, why don't they record those sayings?
Bart Ehrman's point lines up with what a lot of historians and biblical scholars have been saying for decades. The way Jesus is portrayed changes over time because early Christian beliefs were evolving. The Gospel of Mark, written around 70 AD, doesn't show Jesus calling himself divine. Instead, he talks about God's kingdom and calls people to repent. That matches what we see in the hypothetical Q source as well, an early collection of Jesus' sayings with no claims to divinity. These are the earliest layers of the tradition, but by the time we get to the Gospel of John, written 20 to 30 years later, the message has shifted. Now Jesus talks about himself, his identity, his relationship to God, and his divine authority. That change reflects a growing belief among some Christians that Jesus wasn't just the Messiah, but something more. Historians like Larry Hurtado and James Dunn have traced this shift and shown that early Christian communities gradually developed a high Christology, where Jesus was eventually worshipped like God. But that view wasn't present at the beginning. Even the Apostle Paul, writing earlier than all four Gospels, never quotes Jesus claiming to be God. Instead, Paul talks about Jesus being exalted after his resurrection. So when Ehrman asks why these divine claims only show up in the later Gospel, he's pointing to something backed by history, text, and serious scholarship. Belief in Jesus' divinity grew over time. It wasn't part of the earliest message. Let's hear what Peter's response to all this is.
So this developmental idea in the Gospels and the earlier Christian, later traditions around Jesus are developing the idea in the words.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great example of showing how so much scholarship, while claiming to be historically neutral, is basically very philosophically driven. Because I think even as you tease out your chronology and your development, I mean, it's really interesting how it's all stacking up towards a system in which you don't get Jesus, claiming as much early on. And I think that it's been developing for a couple hundred years within scholarship, and it's so intertwined, the historical argumentation and the sort of slight philosophical nudges here and there, that it's really, really hard to unpick. But I would just say, let's take Mark's Gospel as an example. Mark begins with this opening, I'm going to send my messenger before your face, and it's all about, quoting the Old Testament, but with John the Baptist going before the face of Jesus, when, it's about, in Malachi, that it's from, the messenger going before the face of God. And so it's presenting Jesus as in that place of God. Next chapter, he's forgiving sins. Couple of chapters later, he's stilling the storm like only God does, and it's calling on themes from Jonah. Couple of chapters later, chapter 6, he's walking on the water like only God does in Job chapter 9, and then he gets to the boat and he says, "Be of courage, I am." It's pretty dramatic. I am. They're in Mark 6 verse 50. It's not just that John's "I am" saying is slightly different, but there is precedent for them. And I'd want to say a lot of people see this as a systematic presentation of Jesus's very, very exalted status, such that people are wondering, who is this? They're asking this question, and the fact that it's doing it through a sort of more Socratic method of getting you to think who this is not, I mean, God's the only one who opens the eyes of the blind, and that's also something Jesus does, uniquely in the Gospel. So I'd want to say that all of these things come together to give you a very exalted portrait of Jesus.
So there's a consistency, as far as you're concerned, between those earlier, if you like, accounts in Mark.
I think the whole question of development, we've got to say, when we lay out sources and we say this comes before this and this, what actually are we basing that on? How much is historically verifiable? How much of it is philosophical system? How much of it is literary system? And what's fed into that? And I think all of those things have to be laid on the table so that you can be very clear about when you're saying this is a fact. What's it actually based on?
Yeah, so I'd love to respond to that. I mean, Pete, when you start out by saying that this chronology, the development is based on a chronology that's driven by skepticism.
I didn't say driven by skepticism, but okay.
What did you say?
I think it's got an input of that.
Because I was just going on your chronology. I mean, you said earlier that you think Mark was the first gospel.
I haven't said that.
Oh, okay. You said that you thought John was the end of the first. It was the last gospel.
Yes, I have said that.
Which one do you think is first?
I don't have a view.
Okay. Would you agree John's later than the others?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's all. That's the only development I need, and I don't see why skepticism has anything to do with it. I mean, I believe this when I was an evangelical Christian. And but then you want to say that it's wrong to say that Jesus isn't portrayed as divine in Mark because of all these other things.
And I know you can go through them one by one.
No. I mean, there are things you say that aren't true. I mean, it's not true that only God can heal the blind. Prophets do it all the time. Faith healers do it. So they do it with the power of God.
In the Old Testament?
Yes. So, and in the New Testament, I mean...
where in the Old Testament people heal the blind?
Well, in Jewish tradition, it's all over the place.
Yeah, but not in the Old Testament.
Yes. But why would you say that only God can heal the blind? I mean, I know people who say they were blind that
I'm trying to think, in the Old Testament, where are there people who heal the blind other than God?
I don't know of any.
There aren't any.
So... But I didn't say anything about the Old Testament.
So I was saying, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm saying in the Old Testament portrayal, only God heals the blind, and then Jesus comes along and does it. That's
but so do other Jewish healers.
I think it's significant the way Jesus is portrayed. If you think about the
It doesn't make somebody divine to be able to heal somebody. You have healers throughout history. They aren't God. They're empowered by God.
But I think that... the signs in the message to John the Baptist is one of the things.
Okay. So that's just a side point. I just don't think it's true. Yeah. But it doesn't really matter. You're saying that Mark portrays Jesus as divine, and that has no bearing on what I was saying. I didn't deny that. I think that Mark does see Jesus as divine. What I'm asking is, what did Jesus himself say about himself? Now. You pointed out things like John the Baptist looking to Jesus, Jesus walking in the water, Jesus healing the blind. I mean, we could talk about each of all those, but I'm agreeing that Mark portrays Jesus as divine. My question is, did Jesus go around Palestine, Galilee, and then Judea, saying, I and the Father are one? Before Abraham was, I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. These are sayings found in the Gospel of John, which you agree is the last of the Gospels. Those sayings are not found in Mark, which you agree is an earlier Gospel. And they're not only found not in Mark, they're not found in Luke, they're not found in Matthew, they're not from Q, they're not in any of the early sources where Jesus says these things. When you pointed out that in Mark's gospel, people continually are asking, who is this? The answer is never, he is God. And Jesus himself never says, I am God in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or their sources.
I totally agree on that. I mean, there could be all sorts of reasons not to say that. But what I want to say is there is precedent for all of the I am saying. So, for instance, Jesus, I am the bread of life. He says in the synoptics, this is my body, take this bread. He says, I am the good shepherd in John, and then he's portraying himself in stories as basically fulfilling the role of the shepherd. He says, I am the light of the world in John. In Matthew, he says, you are the light of the world to his disciples. If he's prepared to accept they're the light of the world, I don't see why he can't say that he is as well. So I think all of these things we can make connections, and I don't think, yes, the Gospels are about 9 hours long when you read them in English. So in this 2-hour section of John, there are things which aren't in the others. But don't build a massive, castle out of that. I mean, it seems to me, of course, there are going to be some things that are in one that aren't in the others.
No, I agree with that.
Peter says Mark shows Jesus doing things only God can do, like healing the blind or calming storms. But in Jewish tradition, prophets like Elijah and Elisha did miracles without being divine. There's no verse in the Old Testament that says only God can heal blindness. That idea developed later. He also points to Jesus saying, "I am" in Mark 6, but in Greek, ego eimi just means "it's me." It doesn't carry the same weight as in John, where it echoes God's name in Exodus 3:14, and people try to kill Jesus for it. That doesn't happen in Mark, which shows it's not the same kind of claim. Most importantly, Ehrman asks the right question. If Jesus actually said things like, "I and the Father are one," why does no early source mention it? Not Mark, Q, Matthew, Luke, or even Paul. The simplest answer is those sayings developed later, as belief in Jesus grew. We can almost get who has the stronger argument here. Let's hear what they have to say until the end.
I'm not trying to build a castle out of it because I'm just responding to Justin's question. This wouldn't be a point that I would have raised. I mean, I don't. This wouldn't be. This is not why I think the Gospels are unreliable. So this isn't. For me, this isn't even the point. But I will say that the whole idea of development is that there are things earlier that get developed later, and so the fact that you see things earlier that could lead to John's proclamations that's what the developmental view is. What you don't get is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus saying that he's God. And my point is, if the historical Jesus really did go around saying those things, it is inconceivable to me that our earliest sources fail to mention it. Like, they didn't think that part was important. This would be the most significant thing to say, and yet none of them, not just Mark, but Matthew and their sources, by the way. I mean, I don't know what you think, but virtually every scholar I know thinks that you've got Mark, and you've got Q, and you've got M, and you've got L, and then you've got Matthew, and you've got Luke themselves. You've got 6 sources before John. None of them has these things. And so are we supposed to think, well, yeah, that was just like a minor detail they decided not to get into?
Bart makes a critical point here that Peter doesn't really address. If Jesus actually claimed to be God during his lifetime, why do none of our earliest sources record it? We're talking about 6 different sources before the Gospel of John: Mark, Q, M, L, Matthew, and Luke. And not one of them includes Jesus saying things like, "I and the Father are one," or "Before Abraham was, I am." These aren't small statements. They would have been central if they were part of Jesus' real teachings. Yet they only appear in John, which was written nearly 60 years after Jesus' death. That's not an oversight. That's evidence of theological development. As Bart says, seeing small seeds of divinity in earlier texts doesn't mean Jesus claimed it himself. It shows how beliefs evolved after his death. Just like how later Christian communities gave him titles like Son of God or Logos, the sayings in John reflect what believers came to believe, not what Jesus historically said. Peter focuses on symbolism and hints, but Bart is asking the historical question: what did Jesus actually say about himself? And if the answer is nowhere in the earliest texts, it's reasonable to conclude he didn't claim divinity during his lifetime. We can almost get who has the stronger argument here. But what do you think? Do you believe Jesus really claimed to be God during his life, or is that something added by later believers? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this breakdown, like the video and subscribe for more historical deep dives.
I just find it completely implausible.
But I think, John doesn't have Jesus go around saying, "I am God," either. So I think...
I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am.
Yeah, these are big things. But, when you walk up to... okay, you may not believe it happened, but when it's portrayed as someone walking up to people on the water and then saying, "I am," it's a pretty dramatic thing, isn't it?
In the Gospel of John, the man born blind is asked, "Were you the one who was born blind?" And he replies, ego e me.
Sure.
I am.
Sure.
Saying I am is just a way of saying yes.
Yeah, but it's not just that when you're just walked across the water. It's something
Peter
different. It's
walked
something
on the
more.
water too.
Yeah, but
Okay, does that make him God?
No, again, but there is a
But
difference.
he was the one who fell down, of course. I mean,
Exactly. He wasn't as exactly within the story. But Peter doesn't go around saying
But
I am.
what do you think Mark 6 is about when Jesus walks on the water? I mean, isn't this portraying
He's showing
something?
that God. I think Mark understands Jesus as a divine being.
I should start off by saying I don't actually think that it's possible to prove the existence of God. I'm also not a believer that you can disprove the existence of God. I don't think that logical argumentation is going to get you there one way or another. And so I'm not going to try and do that with Alex today, because I think that if people would have been able to provide dispositive proofs, then people would believe them. And if people were able to provide dispositive proofs that God does not exist, then people would be more apt to believe those as well. What I think is an atheist delusion is that it is possible to live ideologically purely in a way that does not rely on fundamental faith principles. When I say faith principles, I'm not going to make the claim that those faith principles are direct from Sinai, or that those faith principles require the New Testament, for example. I'm going to make the claim that there are a bunch of principles upon which we base ourselves that are external to what we know about nature and evolutionary biology, and that many of the things that Alex does in his daily life, for example, are going to be things that rely on principles that are external to a philosophy that would assume a lack of the supernatural, a lack of the extra natural. So some of those principles, for example, are free will. So every day we get up, we believe, virtually all of us, whether we say we believe it or not, we actually act in ways that betray the idea that we believe that we have control over our own actions, at least to a certain extent, and that control makes a difference in the world. And that's what gives us purpose. It's what allows us to wake up in the morning and make the decision to do what we believe is right or what we believe is wrong. That the principles of right and wrong are external to evolutionary biology. So both of these principles that I've mentioned already, free will, right and wrong, these come from a language that is external to the Darwinian language of evolutionary biology. If you're talking about free will, there is nothing in nature that suggests the ability to make a decision free of environment and genetics in combination in some sort. The same thing is true of right and wrong, the idea that there is a right and there is a moral wrong that we can reason our way to. Another principle that I think that you're obviously very big on, it's something that you rely on all the time, your entire podcast is based on the idea of reason. These ideas do not exist in the context of a purely materialist atheist universe. Now, I'm not going to make the claim that I can prove that it's God who's behind those things, because one of the principles of faith belief is that I don't understand God. So for people who don't believe in God, that's an easy way out, right? That's an easy way out for people like me, because I say, well, I don't have to explain the relationship between God and free will, because frankly, I don't fully understand God. But that's not really that's not really an open window. That's just part of pretty much all faith systems, is that if my mind were the mind of God, then I would either be God or God would not exist, one of the two things. So the idea that reason makes a difference in our lives, that we can reason our way to propositions, and that's more than just saying a few magic words and that's setting off a few neurons in somebody else's brain in a naturalistic way, that there actually is principles of truth, another concept that comes from the extra natural world, that these principles exist. So far I've mentioned free will, good, right and wrong, reason, and truth, right? All things that we consider extremely key in our daily lives, and that Alex considers key in what he does. It's, I assume, why you get up every morning, or at least why you feel you get up every morning. You know, what gets you up to do your podcast? It's because you want to say things that you believe are reasonable, are going to convince people to act in a better way, or I assume not a worse way, that get people to change their lives in some way in a self-motivated fashion. That's not merely in a sort of Pavlovian response to circumstance and environment. So if I were going to talk about the atheist delusion, that's what I would suggest is the delusion, that an atheist can use terminology that is drawn from a world that is external to atheism for itself. And again, that's not an argument for God even. That's just an argument against atheism. Again, I think the arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. This is one of the things that I've said to Sam Harris. And I think that the difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
Well, something's certain. We don't do cold opens or soft starts here on The Big Conversation.
Ben says, free will, morality, and reason don't make sense without belief in something supernatural. That's not true. Free will is complex but real. Neuroscience shows our brains evaluate choices. Even if we're influenced by genetics and environment, we still have agency. That's backed by research from University College London. Morality doesn't require religion. Studies by Franz de Waal show that empathy and fairness exist in other primates. These behaviors evolved to help social groups survive, long before modern religions existed. Reason and truth are based on evidence, not faith. Science works through testing, data, and logic. We've built medicine, technology, and understanding of the universe using reason alone. No divine source needed. So Ben's claim doesn't hold up. The evidence shows these values can and do come from the natural world. Let's hear what Alex has to say.
The principal disagreement that I think I had with you, Ben, is that there was a subtle, or not so subtle, implication, in my view, that yes, with no God there's no free will, but somehow having God can solve this problem. I mean, you said a moment ago that you don't think you can establish God's existence through reason alone, but assuming that you do believe in the existence of free will, you think it's a real thing that you have.
Yes.
And simultaneously saying that if there is no God, then free will makes no sense.
Yes.
That does read to me like an argument for God's existence, such that in order to either say that there is free will, in order to say that there is free will, one must believe in God. And that does strike me as an argument for God's existence.
I mean, to slightly curve that, or to kind of sand off the rough edges there, I would say that the argument I made is an argument for something extra natural.
Sure.
Now, you can call
Okay.
that God or not God, but the thing that I'm making the argument for is that you cannot get from a materialist Darwinist universe to
Yes.
free will. That is not possible. So I know that the way you solve that is that you say that there is no free will.
That's right.
And what I'm saying to you is you don't act that way.
I hear this all the time. People say, look, you may say there's no free will, but you don't act as though that's the case. I suppose that I'm just confused as to what it would look like for somebody to act as if they believe there was no free will. I mean, the very argument that there is no free will that I subscribe to, at least one of the various forms that it takes, is a sort of Schopenhauerian view that you can do as you will, you just can't will what you will. And that you are essentially just a biological machine reacting to its internal and evolutionary drives. That's what's happening. Now, call that nihilistic if you like, that's a separate question, but as to the question of how this would make one act, the idea that this might cause us to sort of lay around in bed all day or something, the very mechanism that I think is responsible for eliminating the possibility of free will, that is, the drives that make people do what they do, like I say, do exactly that. Make people do what they do. They make them get out of bed in the morning. Why do you get out of bed and go and make your breakfast if there's no free will? So well, you go and get breakfast because there's no free will and something is driving you to do that that's outside of your control.
For sure. So to get back to the nihilism point, which you kind of put aside, so that means that this conversation is essentially worthless in any sort of real sense. I mean, effectively, we were driven here by evolutionary biology and environment to have this conversation. Everybody who's watching this is driven by evolutionary biology and environment to have a particular reaction to that thing, and ever round the cycle goes. That seems like a very purposeless life. Again, I'm drawing from a realm that is not evolutionarily biologically connected. The word purpose is really, teleology obviously has been taken out of the realm of science pretty thoroughly by atheists and by many people in the sciences, although I would argue that, again, most scientists speak in the realm of teleology literally all the time, and they're borrowing language from the language of teleology, even when they're describing functions of particular body parts, right? The heart pumps blood in order to keep you alive, right? They're constantly using language that's teleological in nature. The real question that I have, and this is what goes to the question that you were asking at the beginning, before the sort of pre-question question, which was the good of religion to society. One of those goods is people believing that their free will matters and this actually is a useful thing. So I believe that it is deeply important for people in society to believe that they have the capacity to change themselves and to make different decisions than what biology would drive them to do. So you say, well, it's biology that drives you to get out of bed in the morning, which is almost Calvinist in sort of the way that it's described, right? It's like you're predestined to get out of bed in the morning, so thus you get out of bed in the morning. But the reality is that we are constantly making decisions as though those decisions make a difference in the universe. And what social science actually does tend to show is that when people believe that they have control over their own actions, then when they believe that they're capable of changing the way that they live, they do make those changes with more alacrity and in better directions than if they don't believe that. If people tend to believe in a deterministic universe, they do act worse. So it may work. This is going to be sort of Straussian in its implications, but that may work for you. you're a very high IQ individual who can somehow reconcile the idea of living a very purposeful life with the idea that actually there's no purpose to anything. But for the vast majority of people, that is not actually how they live. And I would suggest that even in your daily life, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, man, my biology is driving me this morning to get on the bike, have a great day, the sun is shining. That's my biology doing this. And I don't think that most people who live purposeful lives, even if they believe that everything they're doing is predetermined by the world around them, by their own biology, I don't believe they actually feel that. They have to engage in what they themselves would term an illusion in order to feel a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives.
Of course.
Alex is right to challenge the idea that belief in free will prove its existence. Neuroscience shows otherwise. In 1983, Benjamin Libet ran experiments where participants moved their hands while tracking brain activity. The brain's motor cortex showed activity hundreds of milliseconds before the person reported choosing to act. Later studies, like those by John Dylan Haynes in 2008 using fMRI, found that researchers could predict a person's decision up to 7 seconds before they were consciously aware of it. That directly supports Alex's point. We don't will our will. Our decisions are shaped by unconscious brain processes influenced by genetics, environment, and prior experience. Ben also says that not believing in free will leads to purposelessness, but that's not what the research says. Studies from Yale and University of Arizona show that people who understand determinism can still find meaning and motivation, especially when they focus on long-term goals, values, and social impact. In short, we don't need to believe in metaphysical freedom to live full, moral lives. What we need is a better understanding of how we work, and that's exactly what science gives us.
Of course, but that's what the evolutionary process, in my view, in my worldview, I should say, has done so well, is provide precisely that illusion. I mean, it's not as that, I mean, you say, look, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, gosh, you know, look at my biological
My neurons
drive.
are firing, yeah.
Of course not, because if I did, then the whole evolutionary purpose that this illusion serves would fall away. I mean, you say that this is a fairly purposeless life, and perhaps, you know, the implication is that it's a bit of a depressing one. I didn't come here to inspire optimism in people. I just think it is in fact the case.
By the way.
It is in fact the case that free will doesn't exist. And we may feel very nihilistic towards that, but as a wise man once said, facts don't care about your feelings. And I will say that the argument against free will, in my view, is based upon something broader than just scientific analysis or empirical research. Rather, we can build an argument, I think, from a law of logic, the proposition that P must either be true or false, and it can't be both, it can't be neither. It has to be one or the other. Now, this law of the excluded middle, one of the foundational precepts of philosophy, we can simply ask a question of any kind of mental activity, and this will be regardless of whether it's material or immaterial. That's what makes this a crucial argument, and an important one, a pertinent one, is that you can ask of that mental activity, is it determined or is it not? That is it determined by anything else, or is it completely undetermined by anything? If it's undetermined by anything, then it's random, and you're by definition not in control of that which is random. If it's determined by something, then it's either determined by something further inside your mind, or inside your brain, or indeed inside your soul, or it's determined by something external to your brain. If it's determined by something external to yourself, I should say yourself rather than your brain here to rid this conversation of any implicit materialism, exterior to yourself, if that's what's determining the action, then clearly you're not in ultimate control of that action. If it's something inside of yourself somewhere, then all you do is push the problem back and you ask the question again, is that thing determined or is it indeterminate? So indeterminate, it's random. Determined, you keep going back until you either terminate in something outside of the self, something, or I suppose something undetermined and therefore random, either of which you are completely out of control in. If you say that it terminates in something like a soul, people like to do this. They say, well, look, with a religious philosophy, we have the benefit of introducing a soul. That doesn't solve anything. Because you still need to, it's not a matter of having to explain the mechanism by which the soul brings about actions. That may well be a mystery. But if it is the case that whatever it is that's doing that is either determined or it's not, and that if it's not, it's random and therefore out of your control, and that if it is, it ultimately terminates in something outside of yourself or something random, and both of which are out of your control, free will cannot exist.
Well,
and so I would be careful.
That argument does rely on the complete deconstruction of the self. Right? I mean, you're using the term self in this argument in, I think, a couple of different ways. You're saying something outside yourself, but then you're breaking down the self into a bunch of separate components as though the self is a computer. right? Is that if you took the self and you broke it down into a machine, and there's like there's the microchip, and you've got the processor, you've got all these different parts of it. So it has to be coming from here, or it has to be coming from here. But I think the very idea that we have of ourselves as selves is as a deciding being. And so the attempt to carve that down into, so which parts of the deciding being, that is an avoidance strategy. So I don't think that the argument quite holds.
Well, if we can call the self just a deciding being,
call it a deciding being,
then that sort of fundamental assumption that we make about the nature of the self, I don't think is going to be incompatible with atheism.
How so?
Because we're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms, as you've described. I see that your view of the self is an atheist view of the self, a meatball wandering through space, as I've put it somewhat colorfully. The sort of Spinoza idea that you're a stone that's been thrown, and you can comprehend that you've been thrown, but you're a stone that's been thrown, and that's just the way that it is. Why would there be in atheist philosophy such a thing as a deciding self? The deciding self, the deciding being, is external to the idea of an evolutionary cause, because the very word deciding suggests uncaused decision making, and you've just excluded it through your own philosophy.
Uncaused decision making, I suppose, is a concept that I think is unintelligible, and therefore, if there is an unintelligibility of the self on atheism, I suppose the thrust of the criticism that I made to essentially every point you made in that video, except for the argument from motion, is that what you're saying to me, if it applies to atheism, I think simultaneously applies to theism as well.
How so?
An uncaused decision. I mean, what is the process by which a decision is made?
But now you're falling into the same sort of argument that I excluded at the beginning, which was I said that the beauty of religion is that there's a bunch of stuff I don't understand. So I can't explain to you how the uncaused self makes decisions.
Well, then I can't explain to you how the uncaused self exists on an atheistic
But you have
framework.
a burden and I don't. Meaning that
I don't think that's the case.
You do, though. I mean, the simple fact is that you are the one who's claiming that a reasonable materialist universe is the cause of all. And so if that's the case, you do have to explain the mechanism in a way that I certainly do not. My entire philosophy rests on the positing of an entire realm of things I don't understand in terms of their interaction with the world. Now, as I said at the very beginning, that leaves me a giant escape hatch. I'm not going to pretend that that's not a giant escape hatch. It acts in practice as a giant escape hatch. It also tends to act as a fundamental principle of faith, right? Again, in every moral realm, right? When you get to the problem of good and evil, right? One of the big questions is, well, how can God allow evil to take place in the world? And the fundamental religious answer, as it has been for thousands of years, is my mind is not God's, which is a giant escape hatch. It also happens to be true from a religious point of view.
So if I may, that there are two sort of escape hatches here. There are two appeals to mystery going on here. And it seems to me that what you're saying is something along the lines of my simple appeal to mystery here is disallowed in the way that you're allowed to appeal to this mystery because I'm the one making the claim. I think that
not because I'm the one making the claim, but because
I'm the one with the burden.
In
the context of this discussion,
sorry, I'm missing the who's the you and the who's the I in
yes.
the sense, but yes.
I see what you mean. I'm speaking for myself there.
Sorry.
If in the context of this discussion, this began the subject which I think is the first one you bring up in this video, free will. Here's this thing that I think exists, and on the basis of its existence, think entails the existence of a God, or at least points to the existence of a God. I shouldn't say entail. And then when I say that I don't think that the concept of free will is intelligible, and you say, well, how is it intelligible on atheism? And I say, I'm not sure it is, but it's not on theism either. And you say, well, there's my escape hatch. I can appeal to mystery. I don't think the burden is on me there. I think you were the one who's making the claim that free will does exist, that there is this mysterious property of the universe that escapes this determined or indetermined dichotomy. And then when I say that this is unintelligible to me, and based on what I see to be fundamentally appeal to a law of logic, suddenly I'm the one making the claim. I'm the one with the burden who has to do the proving.
No, the actual claim that
Alex's final point is clear. If we can't explain free will in naturalistic terms, that doesn't make religion right. It just means no one has a full answer. But unlike Ben, Alex doesn't hide behind mystery. Ben openly admits he can't explain how the soul produces decisions and simply says, that's the beauty of religion. But that's not an answer. That's giving up on the question. What Alex does instead is break the problem down using logic. If your actions are determined, you're not free. If they're random, you're not in control. Either way, true free will doesn't exist. This isn't just opinion. It lines up with neuroscience and philosophy. In fact, modern thinkers like Galileo, Spinoza, and Schopenhauer, as well as current philosophers like Dirk Pereboom and Sam Harris, have shown that free will, as commonly understood, collapses under scrutiny. Ben's claim that religion helps society by giving people the illusion of control may seem comforting, but it's built on shaky ground. Social stability shouldn't depend on false beliefs. We can build meaning, morality, and accountability on science, empathy, and reason, without needing to pretend we're metaphysically free. So, is religion good for society because it preserves belief in free will? Or is that just a crutch, used when better tools exist? What do you think? Does truth matter more than comfort? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown, like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next deep dive.